So that was the pre-industrial family. So what changed? Whereas in our family in the fields, in order to survive, what they had to do was to grow corn or wheat till the soil. They probably in the back would have had a single cow and a single pig that would provide them with milk and meat and cheese and whatever else they needed for probably a very healthy subsistence diet. But what changed primarily what changed was, and certainly in Europe, the ownership of the land. Whereas in feudal times, there were certain sort of tracts of land set off for the use of people who were poor, like that. And they had the right to farm these strips of land and to get the means of survival from that land, providing they paid a certain sort of tax, if you like, in food to the person who owned it. So these are the peasants, you've heard that term, who lived on strips of land that were owned by the lords, but they were allowed to survive on those strips of land, providing they gave what was called the surplus of their production, whatever they had, first of all the best, and then the surplus to the people who owned the land. That's you can see there are some parallels in a minute. You'll see that with capitalism. But what changed was that the people who owned the land as feudalism began to weaken as a political, especially economic source of wealth, the people that owned the land began to use it differently. It wasn't useful anymore as a sort of an adjunct to there are all sorts of very complex reasons. I won't lecture you about the transition from feudalism to capitalism. If you're interested, there's a lot of information about that to be had. But the primary thing that changed was that the people, the peasants, the majority who had access to these strips of land that allowed them to survive were pushed off because they had no legal and political rights. They were very poor and they were living subsistence. They certainly had no ownership rights. They were just told go. Now, they enacted laws which were called the Enclosure Acts. In England, these Enclosure Acts were the kings then, because there wasn't a new parliament at that time, the kings enacted these acts in order to make sure that the people who owned the source of wealth, the land, could use it in a different way. The peasants were a nuisance because there are a lot of them, and because they actually, it was like having squatters, I suppose, in rented accommodation. You basically had to get rid of them, and so they passed several laws to do that. So then the consequence of that was that misery was probably the consequence of that for these poor peasants. And many of them, of course, starved to death because there wasn't any state welfare or anything amazing like that. They simply had to do something else in order to survive. But the parallel development was that the production of wealth began to shift from the land to the production of industrial goods. Again, this is a long historical sort of process, relatively long, but the driver of it would have been, or two drivers, one would have been colonial and the emergence of colonies, the mining and expropriation of raw materials from those colonies, especially cotton, and the production of goods and particularly textiles initially in the West, especially in the Protestant countries of Europe, the production of textiles and for a mass market, for an increasingly mass market. That production had to, instead of taking place as it used to do, when people used to weave things and make their own clothes or pay someone to make their clothes for them if you were rich, in little cottages with little hand looms, which have been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, in order to supply a mass market, you had to have mass production. And this is a story of technological development that involved the development, first of all, of water power and then steam power to drive big machines, big looms that would mass-produce textiles, which would be sold all over, increasingly across Europe and then into the colonies across the world. But these enormous machines and centres, which became factories, demanded for their effectiveness a great deal of labour. What was needed. You could get the raw material from India, the cotton from India and from the colonies. You could develop the technological side of production by building these enormous engines, or before then building your factory alongside streams with wheels. But what you couldn't do was to produce textile out the other end of these machines without people. So here you have this sort of juxtaposition. This is the history, I suppose, of the emergence of capitalism, feudalism, and the emergence of the change associated with the Industrial Revolution. What this technological development demanded a complete shift in the way where people lived and how they lived and what they did in order to survive. So what changed first of all in factory production was the separation. That instead of working at home like our family in the fields, people no longer had any fields to work in. They'd been sent off them by the Enclosure Acts. They were forced to work in the factories in order to live. But the factories weren't in the country. They were close to, well, at first they were close to big streams, but later, as the steam engine developed, or the steam power was developed, these big machines could be located anywhere. So where they were located was the closest place to export what was being produced. So here we see the rise of industrial cities, that cities themselves became the hub of production, and because they were the hub of production, they were the hub of the source of work for everybody who had previously worked on the land. So we have a separation of spheres. You'll see this in the book, this phrase, separation of spheres, of family spheres. So instead of the family working and living together, the family was forced to the family home ceased to become the place of production. People had to go out to work and work for wage in order to live. So that change also shifted the sort of even though there was a division, a patriarchal division in the pre-industrial family, nevertheless the women worked alongside the men, and their roles were equally important to the survival of this group. But once the source of work moved outside the family home, it was more likely to be the male who was forced to go and work outside the home. And what that meant was, for women, the home became the place where they worked, lived, reproduced their children, but they weren't paid. So this is the beginning of the sort of the imbalance of gendered economic power between men and women. Once women roles were not equal to men in the survival of the family by producing what they needed to survive, then the value of what people did, what men and women did in this family unit, shifted. The men had to go out to work to earn the money to keep the family alive, literally. The women stayed in the home, earned no money, and really were the sort of almost a functionary within that relationship. Something occurred to me when I was talking then, and I've forgotten. This gender division of labour, which is part of the feminist theory, when you read it in the book, the feminist theory of the family will say that the family, almost from its inception, was an institution which supported the subordination of women. And with the emergence of the industrial family and of wage labour in factories, you can see some support in that. But nevertheless, the family did have an economic value, and again, the feminist theories will argue that even though women didn't work for a wage, without what they did in the home, there would have been no unit, there would have been no workers to continue to work, and people would have starved to death. Okay, let's look, just a bit of a break. I showed you this put this photograph in as a sort of contrast between this, the rural picture of the family working in the fields. This is a sketch, probably a wood cutting, I think, This is Manchester, where I lived for about 20 years, 19 years. Brought my kids up. Actually, it wasn't unlike this sort of arrangement. It's very typical if you've been doing it. In industrial cities, it's a very typical arrangement of poor housing. People lived in terraces, or what in New York or US are called tenements blocks. They're sort of small, narrow houses that are linked one to another. These are called terrace houses, which in some parts of the UK now sell for millions of pounds. Millions of pounds, but they certainly weren't built for those sorts of values. What you can see here is that there's a very high density housing. The population of cities grew enormously from the beginning to the end of the 19th century by a factor of about 8. Massive increase in industrial population of industrial cities in the West, as indeed this is happening now in China and other of the sort of primary producing countries of the world. It was very important that the workforce was close to the factory. And in this part of Manchester, which is not too far away from where I lived actually, I think it was, but this part of Manchester was very close. I mean, there would have been huge factories, and there are still, although they're all now posh sort of inner city dwellings and apartment buildings, but they were huge brick things built in the sort of early part of the 19th century, huge brick buildings that produced textiles, that spun the cotton and the flax that came from various parts of the world, and the machines were controlled by the people who lived in this housing. The housing, of course, was, as I said, it was very densely populated. This is another illustration from probably, I'd say it's still England because of the sort of sign of the pub there. It's probably still, and maybe that would be London. But you can see a number of features here. You think about our grouping under the tree. Remember our grouping under the tree, and we talked about how they looked, how they were grouped together. And I think the thing that strikes me most about the difference between our grouping under the tree and this group, who could well be some sort of extended family, but they certainly would be neighbours, is that they all look pretty miserable, as indeed they might, because they lived in poverty. They would have been cold, hungry, living in very overcrowded accommodation with rats and endemic disease. It was quite dreadful. If you read Charles Dickens, who wrote his works, his descriptions of London from the middle of the 19th century onwards, you'll read very accurate descriptions of this sort of life.